Hi everyone, my name is Cynthia. Let's talk books. Today I am here with my first of several videos in which I will be discussing the best books that I read in 2021. 2021 was overall a very good reading year, so I'm dividing up my list into different categories. So today I'm going to talk about the best nonfiction books that I read in 2021, and anybody that has been watching my video for any length of time will have noticed that I read quite widely. Even in the nonfiction category, I could probably divide this into different categories, and the two most prevalent kind of themes and genres that I read in the nonfiction category were memoirs and history books. I read a lot of historical nonfiction because I'm a history professor. So let's get started. This is going to be a list of 10 books, and this is in no particular order. And I also did not intend to pick exactly 10 books. I just started going through my list of books that I read in 2021, and it turned out that 10 really stood out in my reading. So the first one that I'm going to be discussing today is Why Learn History When It's Already on Your Phone by Sam Wineburg. I really recommend this book to anybody that is thinking about teaching, especially history, to anybody who teaches history. I actually used this book in one of my classes for future history teachers, and I really loved it because Weinberg really broke down the problem with the way we do like standardized testing in history, but also why those like surveys that studies sometimes do of like how much history students remember, how much about the Holocaust people remember, why they are so bad. and it's just really good information, and it's an excellent book, even if you're somebody who is not planning on teaching history, but you really like history. This might be of interest to you. I really enjoyed it, and I think the students in my class really got a lot out of it. The second book on my list is a work of historical nonfiction. This is Reimagining Liberation: How Black Women Transformed Citizenship in the French Empire by Annette K. Joseph-Gabriel. So this goes directly into some of my favorite topics for teaching history. So women's history, Caribbean history, history of racial relationships. So this book focuses on several women in the Caribbean and African diaspora that really made a difference in how legally citizenship was defined. So this is especially after World War II, when France rewrote its constitution, and how these women really pushed for Caribbean peoples and women, and Black women in particular, to be included in the definition of citizenship. So, for example, the first chapter is on Suzanne Césaire. Then we have Paulette Nardal, Eugénie Ebouletel, Audrey Boulon, and a bunch of other women. Those three women in particular stand out because they were married to very famous men who really end up getting a lot of the attention, who most people will know about. But then the ways in which these women really shaped things is left out, and they in their own right had a huge role to play culturally and legally, because a lot of them ended up being representatives of like places like Guadeloupe, Martinique, and elsewhere. Anyways, this is an excellent book, a bit academic. So if you are used to reading historical nonfiction, this might be something that is worth it for you. If not, if you don't usually read a lot of nonfiction, you might find it too academic. I will link the video I did wrapping this book up down below if you're interested on it though. The next book that I want to talk about is one of the memoirs that I read this year. It is I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. I read this with my friend who lives in South Korea, and we both just had a lot to say about this book, a lot to learn from this book. Maya Angelou writes a memoir so beautifully, so excessively, in deceivingly simple terms, but incredibly poetic. And just the things she ends up living through and discussing are wonderful. Like, she goes from living in the South to living in where was it? In urban areas, in Los Angeles, in San Francisco. Like, she experiences a large part of like American history from World War II to, well, this book I think doesn't go to the present, but for a chunk of time. So I'm actually want to read more of her memoirs. I believe her memoir is divided into several volumes, and this is the first volume. And I cannot recommend it enough. This year when I taught my American history class, I just kept referencing this book a lot, and I almost wish I had assigned it because it just touched on so many issues of race and change in American history. The next book that I want to talk about it's a bit different than all the rest. This is Hyperbole and a Half: Unfortunate Situations, Flawed Coping Mechanisms, Mayhem, and Other Things That Happen by Allie. So apparently this is based on a personal blog, and it's a graphic kind of novel, and it's just hilarious. This is what stands out. She talks a lot about depression, and I think paints a very accurate picture of what depression can look like. What stood out to me though is also just how hilarious and like all-consuming pet ownership can be. She has a dog, and the way she talks about her dog, it was just so relatable and just so hilarious. It was a moment of just hilarity. It made me laugh out loud. And while I cry very easily when reading or consuming movies or television or anything like that, making me laugh out loud is more rare. But she accomplished that in Hyperbole and a Half, and just for that, I'm very grateful. The next book was 68, El Otoño Mexicano de la Massacre de Tlatelolco by Paco, Ignacio, Taibo II. So I did read it in Spanish, but I'll go ahead and link the title and a link to where you can find it in English because it is available translated. This is a first-hand account of kind of that summer in 1968 where a massacre occurred in Mexico City in the lead up to the 68 Olympics held there. And Paco Ignacio Taibo was not actually at the massacre, but he was deeply involved in the student movements of that summer, experienced the violence, the trauma, and reading a first-hand account of that was just really, really fantastic. I just love the way this book engaged with the issue of memory, of trauma, of state violence. It's short and a first-hand account, and I highly, highly recommend it. I will be talking more about that again. I haven't given up on my project of reading books set in 1968. It has ended up taking me more than a year to engage with those books. The next book is The Wounds of Women, Race, Capital, and Feminism by Françoise Vergès. This is a book that was translated from the French, and I'm so glad that it's been translated and that I was able to read it. This is the book that I needed to have read when I was working on my dissertation. For those that don't know, my dissertation was on the French abortion movement of the 1960s and 70s, and what Vergès does in this book is focus on the Caribbean and kind of challenge the typical heroic narrative of the abortion movement in France and of French feminism, which left out race as part of its critique of French society. And it really stood out at the time because at the time in which French feminists were fighting for abortion rights in France, there were forced sterilizations and a birth control movement in the Caribbean, which was funded by the federal government. And so clearly there's a lot of racial implications there. The feminists that fought for abortion rights in France knew this, and some of them were not white, had been deeply involved in the Algerian and the movement against the Algerian War. And so it really stood out that they left race out of the abortion movement. really love this book. It is pretty academic. I did assign this to students and they actually really liked it, which was surprising to me. I thought they were going to find it too difficult, which makes me think that maybe this is more accessible than I thought. It was my honors class though, so take that as you will. But I really loved this book. Next on my list is Mean by Myriam Gurba. This is a kind of work of memoir again. It's like almost like a series of essays in her life in which she is just deeply honest about the abuse she went through, about homophobia, about sexual abuse. So tons of content warnings in this, but I just really loved the way that Gurba talked about all of this. Her critique of the education system in California, especially in Southern California, because this is where she lives. And I just found it really raw, really honest. I loved hearing her reflections on all of this, and I highly recommend it. The next book is right here, Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present by Harriet A. Washington. This is a hard book to read, and I actually recommend reading it the way I assigned it to my class, which is little bits at a time, where you can even like feel free to skip some chapters if it's something you already know about, because it is really heavy material, right? We're talking about the way in which the medical community experimented on Black Americans from the time of slavery, but even about more recent things that will totally shock you, where you're like, wait, this happened within my lifetime. How come I didn't know about this? And it's really horrific stuff that the government did, things that were sanctioned by the medical community, things that should have never happened but did. And it really, I think, should inform the way we talk about public health in this country and people who are kind of afraid of government-funded programs, because a lot of that fear, especially in some Black communities, is founded on reality. This is not people who are, talking about fake government conspiracies or that kind of thing. This is based on reality, on real experiences that get passed down from generation to generation. And I highly recommend this book if you can handle the very difficult topics that it deals with. And then the next two books I read recently, but I really enjoyed them so much that I think they merit a place on this list. The first is The Anthropocene, reviewed by John Green. I have not read anything else from John Green. He typically writes a lot of young adult books. So this is a work of nonfiction, and John Green, I know, does a lot of reading in big history. He was very involved in kind of the early foundations of big history for the public and for education. But in this book, each chapter is an essay in which he basically reviews something in the modern era, something about our current society, and he just does it so brilliantly. He includes enough of his life that you feel like you're learning something about him, and also about kind of global history, and it's just so well done. I highly recommend The Anthropocene reviewed for anybody. I think it's really good. And then the last book on my list is Somebody's Daughter by Ashley C. Ford. This is another memoir. I've been following Ashley for a really long time on Twitter, and so I saw her kind of go through the process of writing this book, at least what she shared publicly. And I knew some aspects about her life. Like, I knew that her father had been incarcerated for most of her life, so most of her childhood, her dad was in jail. What I didn't know, though, is how difficult her relationship with her mother had been. And so this book engages a lot with that, like the difficulty of growing up with her mom, the difficulty of growing up as a Black woman in this country, and what it meant to have her dad incarcerated, what it meant for her to decide to become a writer, how that worked for her. And I just really, I just thought she was so honest and raw, and that, most people can learn something from hearing this story, because she's older, a little bit older than I am, I think, but you get to see, you know, what is essentially modern history of the United States through a different perspective, right? Somebody who grew up in a different place, having a very different experience, and yet some of the traumas can be very similar, and other things not. But I really, really enjoyed it. And it's really hard to talk about these kind of difficult memoirs and say that one enjoyed them. But I think what I mean when I say I enjoyed it, I just enjoyed how honest and raw authors can be in sharing their story, and that there's something to learn from reading the experiences of other people, oftentimes that lived through the exact same time period but had very different experiences than we did. And so I'm really into memoirs at the moment, especially graphic memoirs I've gotten really into. Not many made it into this list, but I'm really into them. And obviously I will continue reading a lot of history nonfiction. If you've read any of these books, let me know. Most of the time I assume that most people haven't read most of like the historical nonfiction that I read. But if you're interested in any of these, let me know. If I have videos discussing any of these books, I'll also link them down in the description box. But thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!